Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for being here today. We are going to be talking about carbon calculations. And today we are joined by EJ Hurst, who is the sales manager at New Society Publishers, and Jen Knoch, who is the senior editor at ECW Press, as well as Andreas Stobberup, project lead at 2K Denmark. So we're going to start off this session by hearing from EJ and Jen. Then we're going to hear a little bit from Andreas, and then we'll move into the Q&A portion. But of course, feel free to pop any queries into the chat at any time. So without further delay, I am going to turn it over to Jen and EJ.
Thanks, Jaren. Good morning, everyone. As Jaren did introduce, I'm EJ Hurst, sales manager at New Society Publishers. I'm also the sustainability lead, and I'm joining you from the unceded territory of the Snuneymuxw Nation in Gabriel Island, British Columbia, Canada, for those of you who are further away. I know I met a lot of you at Frankfurt, which was wonderful and uplifting, so I'm really happy to be with you all again today. And thank you to the Green Book Alliance for the invitation, and to everyone else for joining. So why do we care about measuring carbon emissions? Well, it seems like we're entering an era of increasingly populist and conservative governance. And so it's going to be up to industry to lead the way on climate change. And if we are going to meet the targets that have been set by climate scientists to avoid catastrophic warming of the planet, then everybody needs to act. We all need to act no matter how small our impact may be. And this is because demonstrating that actions can be taken to reduce carbon emissions, that's going to inspire other people to act. And that's what we need. New Society Publishers, we have a long history in this area. Our founders, Chris and Judith Plant, were inspired by the turnaround decade. And I don't mean the turnaround decade of 2021 that inspired the launch of the net zero carbon targets. This is the turnaround decade of 1990, which was announced by David Suzuki. So at that time, they set up a publishing house whose mission was to publish books for a world of change with a minimum impact on the environment. And so that's the mission we still follow today. And part of that was, right from the start, we engaged one of our authors, Guy Dauncey, who wrote a book called Stormy Weather, 101 Solutions to Climate Change. And he wrote a carbon calculator for us, which let us measure our business carbon emissions. And we've been doing that since 2028. And I'm just going to share my screen here. Hopefully you can see our carbon review. I'm just going to share a few graphs. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but this is our emissions from 2008. So as you can see, we've had a 58.84% decrease in carbon emissions since we started measuring them. These are carbon emissions for all types of use. So we measured all of our business emissions, and those really long blue bars, that's printing paper. So you can see targeting emissions is quite easy. Start with your paper. And then just because we wanted to be able to see this better, we took paper out of the equation, and this is everything else. So for us, our following things were shipping, and then our next largest group was business flights. And finally, this is just a really sweet picture of our publisher, Julie Radish, who's hugging a big roll of Sustana paper because we love our paper. By focusing on paper, we reduced our emissions by 57.39%. So of that big drop, most of it was paper. So the big news today, Jen and I are super excited to announce that we are releasing 2 carbon calculators available free to all Canadian publishers. So we have a book footprint carbon calculator, which would calculate the carbon emissions for a single print run. And then we have a publisher business carbon calculator, which allows you to calculate the emissions from all your business, similar to what New Society has been doing. These are available for download from BookNet Canada. And we'd really like to acknowledge the contributions from BookNet. They've been a great supporter, and they've built the website and are hosting it. In particular, acknowledge Knoch, who was a tireless supporter of this project all along the way. I'm going to give you a bit of a background about the tools, and then Jen's going to go into them in more detail. So Jen and I formed an informal support group when we were just the only 2B certified publishers in Canada. And we got together once a month just to talk things over. And pretty early in the relationship, we decided the carbon calculator that we were using needed to be updated and brought up to speed with how the world had changed. And I'm pretty sure it was Jen who said that, wouldn't this be great if they could be available to all Canadian publishers? And voila. We applied and received a grant from the Canada Council Digital Greenhouse. We engaged the wonderful and talented Ian Lipton from the Carbon Accounting Company. And 2 years and many hours of work later, we have 2 carbon accounting tools ready for you to use. The tools are pretty straightforward. They're Excel spreadsheets. And luckily, the most important piece of data is information you will already have. Because the largest carbon impact comes from paper, the work of completing the carbon calculator is not that onerous. It simply uses numbers you already have. How many books did you print, on what kind of paper, and at what printer? Going through the process of using the tools is really great. It helps you really dive into your supply chain. And I learned a lot about our business that I didn't know before. And also it builds relationships between you and your printers, paper suppliers, and also distributors at the distribution end. The results from the calculator, they can be used in many ways. The most useful for us was to target the place where we can have the biggest impact on reducing carbon emissions. But it can also inform print run decisions. It can be used to pursue qualifications like a B Corp certification, or to place some science-based targets. The tools are built, both of them, using the Greenhouse Gas Protocol for corporate accounting and reporting. The book Carbon Footprint Calculator currently uses the EcoInvent database for generic paper emissions. And this does have some drawbacks, licensing being one of them, which is the unfortunate reason why we've had to limit this release to Canada only. It is possible to use the tool elsewhere, and if you email our info, we can give you more information about that. Our hope is that eventually we're going to populate the calculator with actual real paper using their brand names and their own specific carbon emissions. Some companies have those. Sistana Paper has already agreed to join us in this. They're just reviewing their emission standards this year. So we're waiting until they have their updated emission standards, and then you'll see, Jen will show you the drop-down menu later, then you'll see Sistana Paper brands appear, and you can select the one that you've used, rather than currently we have just generic types of paper. Other assumptions used in the calculator, they're noted in the user guides and in the About the Tool tab. Sources include the Greenhouse Gas Protocol emission factors, EPA, Environment and Climate Change Canada, and some other resources, some industry standards are included. So Jen, I think I'll pass over to you to show our wonderful new tools.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out today. I have the pleasure of showing you the goods. This is going to be just like a really quick look at the tools. If you would like to participate in a training session where we go through populating one of the tools, we're going to be doing that with BookNet in February, on February 13th. So you can sign up for that and join us there. But this is just to like give you an idea of what they look like, kind of what's included, and a little look under the hood, I guess. So I'm just going to show you the first one, which is the book calculator. So when we made these, we thought we were making one tool. As it turns out, we were making two, but we really wanted to have one tool that could zoom in on the footprint of a single copy of a book, because we see this as a decision-making tool. It's not just an accounting tool about achieving net zero or anything like that, or reducing your emissions necessarily, but it allows you to see the impacts of different choices we make. Otherwise, we've been kind of guessing, like maybe this paper is better, maybe this trim size is better, maybe printing it in London and putting it on a boat is better. We don't know, but now you can find out, which is very cool. So you can see it's in Excel. It has to be used in Excel. That's one of the limitations. So like no Google Sheets or anything like that. You fill in the white cells, the green cells get calculated by you. I'm not going to do it. We don't have time, but basically to give you a sense, we've got the general specs of a book, things that are familiar to you from quoting. You can include your own in-house submissions if you know them from either your own accounting, from using the other tool, or if you don't, that's okay. That's still fine. So for example, new drop-down menus do appear if you can't answer a question, and then it will help you calculate those a bit. We've got content creation in there to be accounted for, where the paper is made, where it's printed. And then we've got a couple distribution legs. So from paper supplier to printer, and from printer to your main warehouses. So you might pick like one in various countries or a couple in various countries, depending on how your distribution network works. And then you could break a given print run down to say like 10% go to London, 40% go to Nashville, whatever the case may be for you. So obviously there's some estimation here, but generally we kind of know where the target market is going to be for a book. So you could estimate here. We've also got end use. So books that are recycled or destroyed or even gone back into the marketplace can be accounted for. And then at the end, it will spit you out a number that is the carbon footprint per copy of the book, which is this number down here. And also you can see the breakdown of how different aspects, printing, paper production, in-house operations are part of that number. So you can see the percentage breakdown, which is very cool. The other thing to note about this tool, both the tools, is that you don't have to fill in everything. So obviously filling in everything is going to give you the most accurate number. But if you're like, well, I just want to know about trim size, really, you could just fill in those parts and the paper. Like there are some things you would need to fill in. But if you didn't want to put in content creation, you didn't want to put in your in-house operations, you don't care about end use, fine. It will calculate, it'll still work. And so you can just go based on comparing the results from two different variables, for example. So the way that we see this is that you have your book, your cookbook A, you can do one case study, and then you can take the cookbook and change a thing or two and have another case study, and you can see the exact carbon emissions equivalence impacts of those choices. So that's how we see that tool being used. You could use it for every book you publish for thorough accounting, or you could just say, generally, we publish 5x8 books that are 400 pages long. We usually use this paper. This is generally where the books go, and get a sense so that you know. So I'm going to get out of that one, I hope. How do I, okay, here we go. Stop share. My two screens. Okay, so now I'm going to show you the other tool just very quickly. So this is the publisher's carbon accounting tool. So you can see we're still in Excel, looks a little different. Along the bottom of this one, we have various areas kind of broken out by scope. So we could look at those. All the way over to scope 2. Scope 3 is where most of our emissions are happening. So book production, for example, freight, business travel, all of these are broken out. Again, the level of detail that you put into this is up to you. So if you wanted to just say, okay, generally we've printed this many copies of a book, they are on average this long, and we've printed 200,000 copies of that book on average, it can give you a rough sense of what your print carbon emissions might be. You could also put every book you publish on this list if you really wanted to get granular. So the other tool can give you the info to put in here, or if If you don't want to use the other tool, you can just put in your own estimations from whatever research you've done. And again, they could go in here. So this tool is more for people who want to set benchmarks around certain areas of their business. Maybe you want to lower your travel, maybe you want to look at your shipping, whatever the case may be, you can focus in on here. Again, it will work even if you haven't filled everything in. So there's a summary page at the end where it will summarize your emissions by scope, which is pretty cool. And so if you wanted to do offsetting, if you wanted to benchmark, if you wanted to do any number of things, you wanted to certify for something like B Corp, all the information can be here. A note about this one is that this one actually isn't really limited by geography, and because this one has no licensing, there's no eco event emissions factors in this. It's just that the tools work better together. So if you had your own paper numbers, for example, that you wanted to populate into this, talk to us. Cool, we can make that happen. It's the book calculator that is actually using the emissions factors because it goes into the types of paper mostly. So I'm going to stop sharing that. And I just want to show you that also both of these tools come with a guidebook, which you can see here. It kind of gives you an introduction to the tools. It tells you about like the assumptions as EJ made. It links to some other resources and will also take you through certain lines, explain terminology, explain kind of the assumptions that might have gone into that. So each each tool has its own manual for you to use. They're also available to download in the same place. And as I said, we're going to be doing a walkthrough of using the tools live. EJ kind of got into a little bit of the future, which is that we hope to one day do a more specific version of this tool where we have actual papers in there. That's a long process because printers have to have that information. It has to be verified by someone external. They have to be willing to share it. And then we have to get it into the system. So it's a long road. However, we're hopeful that the Sustaina pilot that we do around April will give us a kind of a test case of how that might work. For now, though, there are quite a few. There's about 20 different kinds of paper scenarios that you could implement that will still give you a rough idea. And in terms of the licensing, one further clarification on what EJ said, this has been a complex process because we've kind of had to forge our own path in the licensing space here because we are not a large corporation making a database software that anyone can use, and we're not someone just making it for their own company. We are kind of the awkward middle child. And so we've had to kind of go through a long process with EcoInvent of figuring out what that would be. But we have these 50 licenses for Canada. And if, for example, in the US or the UK, you would like to use these tools, all you would have to do is buy your own set of 50 licenses for a UK tool. These tools are international. The data that's in them, the cities, all of that is ready for that. It's merely a licensing snafu that we've run into. And so you could buy 50 licenses for the UK, for the US, whatever. That's all doable. So that's really the only hurdle. What we want is for people to use the tools as widely as possible, and we're happy to help you figure that out. It was a long road to get here, so we would really just love to see people get in there and hopefully make some changes like the ones that New Society demonstrated.
Oh, perfect. Thanks so very much, Jen and EJ. There you go. Yeah, so there is a link in the chat for that training event if you would like to register to learn more specifically about how to use the Canadian carbon calculator. It is up there, and I'll probably repost it again right at the end. Now we're going to move to hearing from Andreas.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen. You should see it on your screen now. Thank you for having me. I apologize. This will be a speedy run through, but all the slides will be available to whoever wants them afterwards. And some of you might have seen some of this before elsewhere. But I'll start by saying I agree with everything EJ and Jen has said. But looking at print and digital emissions, this will focus on simply just showing tools and trying to provide some visualizations. And afterwards, anybody is welcome to ask questions also on email. When we start by looking at print emissions, we can say that we are privileged being from Europe and Scandinavia in particular. Smaller countries makes it easier to map supply chains. So that's a benefit from us. What I'll be talking about is how we have been using the carbon calculating for a while. We use these ISO standards and as well as the International Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And I think it's important just to know that that all the different calculators uses the same standards, then the averages that are provided creates great action points. It has been the standard for a long time in Denmark, and it has been tested and applied in the industry, which you'll see in a bit. It is the international standard from Intergraph in the EU. This is a picture showcasing what they have included in the scope for printed material. When we look at a sample of a printer that has put some percentages on their substrates, you can see at the top that paper is 61% from this printer in particular, and then different numbers follows. But again, it should help you see that paper is the big issue. It is used with this tool called Climate Calc that has been developed to calculate this. It's implemented at more than 300 printers in the EU now, as I know. And it's also implemented in the UK, and I know they are also beta testing it at some US printers. So this is, again, it's being implemented here. This allows for you to add members from your supply chain, so everybody has access to the different input in this this tool. It will provide you a breakdown of the percentages, as we've just seen, that will be available. Again, the percentages that the split of percentages will, of course, differ depending on especially how big your emissions of the paper are, and there can be some extreme differences across the globe of paper emissions. This is what you will get when you order the book at these certain printers that have applied this. Now we go to a different subject, just quickly to show. When we look at the printers and they provide some samples of a print run of the same book and same materials, we can see that the smaller the print run, the better it is to use the digital emissions compared to offset emissions. But when you go up in print run size, then offset efficiency increases. So again, this is dependent on location of the printer and power usage in production and so on. So this can have some big variables across the world as well. Just to show how it's been implemented in Denmark, and not everybody is necessarily a fan of putting the carbon calculated number on the book, but in Denmark it's been put next to the ISBN number on the back of the book, and it's on the websites where you want to buy the book. You will see what the the emissions of the book is. So this is where it's been implemented, and they are in the process of collecting as much from consumers about this as possible. So this tool has been recently been used to calculate the entire emissions of the Danish publishing industry, which is close to 15,000 tons of CO2. And this is not a big number. We're not a big country, but we're also very privileged of being neighbors to the most efficient paper mills in the world due to their energy mix. So remember, I don't believe that it matters how big your number is. It just matters that you can figure it out and look how to reduce it. But we have worked with some clients in the US and trying to extrapolate some data. So if this is very rough numbers, but when you scale up to the US publishing industry in this sense, it becomes millions of tons of CO2. And you can see the paper has a much bigger part of the emissions. Again, this is just to show that there are variables, and it's important when we talk in this venue with the Green Book Alliance, which is becoming a global player here. When we look at print emissions, there are some technical things you can ask yourself. With the printed book, you can almost roughly times the weight by 1.5, and you get the amount of carbon that is stored in the paper. This is important if you look at paper life cycle in general, not only for the book. We have tested this with the examples you see, and we can produce a 650-page novel with emissions well below 400 grams of CO2, which will in turn have stored 2 pounds of CO2 in the paper used for the book. So technically, you can call it a carbon storage, but this is not factored in when we calculate net emissions, and this is starting to become a big talking point in paper recycling in general, with much bigger industries than publishing. Looking at digital emissions, there are no standards out there, and there are no methodologies like we have with the greenhouse gas protocol. I think you should ask what is the publisher's responsibility, what's doable in practice. The smaller you are, the more you simply need a starting point and a visualization tool. If you're a big publisher, it becomes a requirement, and it's very much compliance driven also. If it's voluntary driven, then you can see the tools that Jen and EJ provided. You can put in the numbers that you can get, and it will give you a very good estimate of what you need to look into. We have created a simple Excel sheet as well, or numbers sheet in this case, trying to estimate digital emissions of ebooks and so on. And this is why you will get the slides afterwards. Seems like I can't go to the next slide. I believe you only need to get these numbers you see over on the to the left. There's a lot of calculation that goes into it, and everybody can get access to this afterwards and ask questions. But I've just quickly thrown in 5,000 ebooks downloaded in the UK and in Canada and in the US as an average, to show that we can actually get some numbers from this. And the thing that will give the biggest emissions by far is the emissions spent reading from the consumers. And again, when we look at an academic journal, this is specific numbers from one of the biggest publishers in the world in this sense. And you can see when we go to this page, sorry, You can see that if you're a small publisher with 15,000 downloads, your digital emissions might not be extreme. But when you start to talk hundreds of millions, if not billions of downloads and reads, the numbers become very different. The digital emissions from this publisher is equivalent to the entire Danish print emissions. So this is very important just to know for your decision making and what you want to include and take responsibility for. What's best? Digital products, they accumulate over time. It doesn't go away. There are an incredible amount of what we can call shadow data. It can be extremely difficult to track, which is why averages in this sense will work very good. There can be up to 10, 20 times difference in emissions worldwide on the same product, depending on where it's produced. And this is not to say or point fingers at anybody. I truly believe that it doesn't matter how high your number is. If you start to measure it, you can start to reduce it. And that's what we need to do as fast as possible. Yeah, that would be that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andreas, for that overview. We're going to move into questions. I see there's already quite a bit going on in the chat, so I do want to read some of those out just to make sure that we don't miss anything. One of the first ones is, I'm interested in hearing how organizations get their arms around all of the variables on an ongoing basis. And EJC, you've already said it does take a bit of time to build up recording systems for the book Carbon Calculator. Much of this is part of the book printing process. So what I'm going to ask from Jen and EJ and then Andreas, I guess, like building off of that, what do organizations need to consider when they are starting to do this work? What do they need? How much effort or time should they anticipate this taking? And is there a best place to start?
I can.
Go, Jen.
Okay. I think that we've tried to design the tools so that you can put in whatever amount of effort you want. We've shown that paper is the most impactful area for sure. So I would say for us, the biggest thing is to look at the book calculator, play around in there with a lot of the specs that you're used to using on your books, and get a sense of how that changes. If that's all you do, you could still make decisions going forward that could lower your carbon footprint, because you could say, well, I can see that this paper is better. I can see that this trim size is better. I can see that we should print digitally in this kind of situation or offset in this kind of situation. So you actually need although like our tools could be overwhelming looking, to use the single book calculator, you really only need the things that you would normally know from a quoting process of a book project. And then there are a couple places where you can do things like ask your printer about what the waste usually is for a certain trim size, for example. But even if you don't do that, we've given you in our guides, we've given you a number you can use instead if you're not willing to do that. So like that could be the work of like an hour.
Yeah, okay, that's good to know. I feel like sometimes this feels very daunting, and so an hour doesn't seem so bad. And what I'm hearing also is a bit of like allowing for some exploration, like playing around with some things and just seeing what you can discover, and not trying to like do everything perfectly right off the bat, because I feel like that seems very stressful. EJ, you maybe had something to add?
Yeah, I was just going to agree with Jen. And if you wanted to use the business calculator, you can also start with the things that you have anyway, like your hydro bill. You're going to know how much hydro you use. Your business flights, you're going to track your business flights. So you could just go through them using everything you already know from your budgeting and financial planning, and then see where you end up. And then, you could start there. And then maybe on the way through, you would get a question about something. Oh, I wonder, where does our recycling go? How much do we recycle every year? And then you can highlight that and be like, okay, that'll be next. We'll start measuring how much do we recycle in a year. And I found the whole process really interesting from that point of view. It opened up a bunch of questions of things I'd never really thought about, assumptions I had. You don't know what you don't know. And then all of a sudden, when it's put in front of you, you're like, how does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. Andreas, do you have anything to add to that?
Just it really doesn't have to be perfect, especially not when everybody is volunteering to do something like this, and it just, you need to start. As I said, if it's a compliance, and I don't care what any big publishers say, it will be a compliance exercise, not because they want it to be, but because they're forced to it by legislation. It is overwhelming in Europe, this amount of legislation, and if you're not bound to be perfect and have these up to 8% of your total revenue in fines if you don't comply, then just start. It doesn't have to be perfect, as they showed with the calculator. Plot in some numbers and get to work, as we talked about before we started. Just look at the flooding, hurricanes, and fires. There's really not a much better way to show that it's everybody needs to do their part.
Yes, we have Brian who said it sounds like just getting started is a good way to get started. But I think, imperfect action is better than doing nothing at all. We have another question. Is there cost information for the 50 license package where the tools are available for download? Oh, I think Jen, and you've already said, there's a one-time fee of 3,000 euros for a lifetime license. So this is another thing that I will mention. If you do have any follow-up questions about licensing or any of the specific calculators, you can reach out to either Jen, EJ, or Andreas respectively, or to GBA, and we'll make sure to connect there. We have, you mentioned
Jen,
paper having quite a...
Jaren, can I just jump in on that fee thing?
Yeah, please.
I don't want to, I'm not doing this to brag or like to blow our own horn or anything, but it looks like a lot of money, that stumbling block. And it came up unexpectedly. It wasn't part of our grant. And so we made a collective decision. We're carbon neutral. And so we buy carbon offsets every year. And Jen can speak to their company, but between our two companies, we actually decided to cover that cost. And so I just want to point that out, because companies sometimes stumble. They're like, whoa, that's a lot of money. And it's like, yeah, it's a lot of money. And sometimes you might have to put that money on the line to get things done. So just wanting to address the sort of financial blocks you sometimes run into, and that, yeah, sometimes that takes support from your company. We both have extremely supportive companies, and not to sort of just stop at that point. There are ways to solve obstacles like that.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, EJ, for that interjection, because I think, yeah, sometimes we need to hear it. Okay, you mentioned paper having quite high carbon footprint impact. Is it overall higher than plastic, for example?
No, plastic is way higher when you look at the life cycle analysis of it. Again, it's not to become too technical, but paper is part of a extremely large ecosystem, and it can be reused for different things and so on. So it depends on if you use what's called an attributional life cycle analysis or a consequential life cycle analysis. And that's just to differentiate a little bit about it or on it. When you look at wrapping for a print order, it's a small percentage, even if it's plastic that is used. The reason why it's paper is because it's almost the entire book, so it's a ton of paper and half a kilo or a pound of plastic to do this. So that's the difference, but not by weight.
It's an interesting question because what we're talking about here is carbon, or like carbon equivalent, like taking the other greenhouse gases and turning them into carbon equivalent. And so our calculators, for example, don't account for those full life cycle impacts. So an interesting thing that can come up in our calculator is that 30% recycled paper has a higher carbon impact than 100% recycled from where we are. And that's because recycling takes energy. However, we also know that if the paper is recycled, that new trees don't get cut down. So, but we can't know what carbon those trees would have absorbed in their lifetime. Can't know if they would have burned up. We can't know those things. So just to say, like, of course, there are bigger life cycle impacts, and really our tools are kind of blunt in the way that they don't look at the full spectrum of a life cycle analysis. We're just looking at carbon. And so again, this doesn't necessarily, you could use the tools and say, oh, but that's not in line with our values in other ways, or this goes against this big picture thing we're trying to do. But it's just giving you sheer carbon to work with.
Yes, okay, that's an important clarification. Thank you. Speaking of which, yes, I do want to clarify that it's been mentioned in the chat. This tool, the Canadian Carbon Calculator, is available for free to its users because EJ and Jen, you have, put it out there and got that licensing. But then we have some follow-up questions. As an American, if you're not Canadian and we're not Danish, is there any hope for us? Some people have some questions, and then follow up with licenses. So with 50 licenses, if a different market wanted to purchase licenses for the calculating tool, presumably costs could be shared across organizations. Would it be okay to split licenses that way? So if there were even 50 organizations who all wanted to contribute, could they each use one license?
Yes. Basically, though, it would be like the one person or one group would be coordinating that license and buying it, and they would have to sort out the accounting. But it doesn't really matter for us. We have to have retrack the downloads, and so that we know who's using it. But yes, if that's the thing. If you have 50 companies, that's a really cheap tool. It's a cheap tool anyway. Let me tell you, it does not cost 3,000 euros to build 2 tools. It costs a lot more than that. So yes, it is still a bargain. You can split those licenses. We had hoped for tiered licensing where we could just license like scads of licenses for all the publishers of the world. But that was reneged during our going through this process. So unfortunately, we just have to have little versions that are each a 50-unit pod. And so however you want to do that, if you have a publishers association in your country, for example, you could do it through them. Yeah, share. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's a great, we've been talking about, sustainability is a group effort and we need to be collaborating on that. So I think that's a very clear way that could be done. We have maybe about 10 minutes left. So I want to also open the floor. I think we've had some great questions in the chat. But does anybody have any questions, comments, thoughts who'd like to chime in within the group? And while I let people think about that, I guess, okay, so a follow-up question here is, where can organizations find support if needed? Obviously, you are just 3 people, and of course we all want to be, doing our part and really trying to support these types of initiatives. But do you have any resources or recommendations or places that people should start looking if they're just getting curious about this?
In our manuals, there are some links to other work that other people have done, such as like analyses that are more life cycle oriented so that you can layer in those factors. We've also tried to explain like some of the common terms like scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions and that kind of thing. So we do have the technical manuals to hold your hand. We will be doing the seminar that will be recorded and available online. So even if you can't attend, you can watch it after and just get more of me and EJ. And then, yeah, you can always email us also if you have specific questions. We do have a survey that's associated with our calculators so that we can get some feedback about your user experience and maybe any changes that it might have inspired you to make. So we will be collecting that data as well to kind of inform what we do going forward.
Yeah, I was trying to think back. I was like, wow, how do you learn about these things? I would like to say the science-based targets, but I find them a little obtuse. But if you look at the net zero kind of information, in your own country, whatever part of the government is dealing with climate change, just for general background information, there's industry groups, not so much publishing industry groups, Green Book Alliance, you can come here, but other sustainable businesses groups, there's often a lot of good educational information there.
I would just chip in that I'm lucky that this is what I do. So spending a lot of time reading all of that stuff, and especially if it's not part of your job title, then it's very difficult, and you might not have the language for sustainability. Like there's a language for law and economics and so on. It depends on what you're educated in, but go to something as simple as YouTube. There are exceptional videos, 2-3 minutes, that can really help you understand and get a visualization of things as you go along. Sometimes it helps to have an image of something in your head before you start reading about something. There are a lot of resources out there, but I think it's actually a good way to learn about these things also.
Thank you, all three of you, for those recommendations. I see we also have in the chat, Kathy, you've said, what about AUP? And Brian has also said, BISG could be a resource in the US market. So that's excellent. We have the question, does the book calculator include data for color books and monotitles?
It doesn't actually, in the sense of ink. So the ink, when we were creating this project, of course, we wanted to account for every little variable because that's who we are. But our very patient designer reminded us that things that were under 1% of the carbon total, we could probably just set aside, which would also make it a less taxing experience for the user to enter. So in the case of your 4-color book, the carbon difference in the ink wouldn't be accounted for, but you're probably using heavier paper. You're probably using coated stock. Those things are accounted for because those are the things that are going to have the actual big impact, is that you're using 100-pound coated stock instead.
Thank you. Okay, I am going to kind of ask one thing, which I think we've sort of touched on, but I really want to hammer this home because I do think, end goals are important, and that is like the why. Like why are we doing this? Which is within, what do organizations do with this data, once they've collected it? Like, how do you utilize it in a meaningful way and keep track of it in a meaningful way that they can, elicit change within their organization, within the industry? Because yes, we're more focused right now on the actual step of doing, because we have to do that before we can, look at moving forward past that. But if we do get past that, what are we working towards? Like, we see, a carbon label on books is an example of that. But do you have any other examples or recommendations or, I don't know, success, inspiration?
I think that we're the book industry might be small in the carbon perspective compared to much bigger industries, but we are also the ones who tell the stories and try to communicate and progress culture. So whatever good you do, make sure you communicate it. You don't have to change the world with what you do, but make sure you tell people about it, because everybody always likes to read a good story in that sense. As you see in the calculator, you can do what you can and track it year by year, trying to become a little bit better. So I think it's so important on your social media or on your website or whatever you're doing, seeing that people are doing stuff like this. I can guarantee you there are many more people on publishers' websites that there are on paper manufacturers' websites. So make sure you tell what you do and tell the great stories from your supply chain. Tell about people who are helping you do it.
Jen or EJ, anything to add to that? That was really, thanks, Andreas.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. It's sort of what I said in my introduction. Your impacts in the volume of carbon emissions may be small, but it's about inspiration and demonstrating it can be done. And it doesn't matter your size or your budget, or just try and be a model and try and tell stories. I realized when I was writing my speaking notes, I'm like, oh, this is a couple of stories. I'm like, oh, well, that's what people like. People like stories. Oh, yeah.
We're in the business of stories, so it's appropriate. I just want to like just virtually high five Andreas for the public communication part, because I think this is something we really fall down on so often as publishers, is like communicating to the public what choices we're making, what the impacts are in an understandable language. And like we've just, as of the fall, implemented like a new back page to all of our books that talks about the choices that have gone into that book, whether it's the fact that we're a B corporation, whether it's the fact that it's printed on this paper and it has this FSC certification, and this is why. It can be, we give 1% of our royalties to a organization chosen by the author, all of these good things that we're doing, which are great, but like consumers have no idea, and they often don't know what it means. So taking the time to translate that, I think, makes a big effect. And I would say anecdotally, it's not necessarily like your average consumer who notices first, but authors do. Authors who are pitching books to our house, who are spending a lot of time looking around our website, trying to figure out who we are and what they're about. When they write query letters, they notice that stuff. So that there's another layer of people who are paying attention, and, that might impact where they want to publish in the future.
Very much to our panelists, Jen, EJ, Andreas, for being here today. I think that was a really insightful talk, and I think hopefully helps us come away with a bit of hope that, you can just get started. As Brian had said, sometimes the best way to get started is to just get started. And I think you've given us a good launch point for that. So thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who's able to attend today. We really appreciate you being here. Thanks, everyone.